This brings us to the early days of ufology and the tales of unearthly encounters with space brothers. Is it possible that these tales were founded in truth? Is it possible that the claims of the many of the late 1940s and 50s UFO contactees were contact with alien intelligences in a process initiated by exposure to natural, terrestrial proto-UFOs? On the left we have George King. And George King is kind of the exception, he's the odd one out in this group, because King never actually claimed physical contact. Although I attended a lecture of David Trimble from the Theorist Society recently, who kind of pointed out that King did actually have experiences with light forms on a particular Devon Peak, but the actual entity contact itself was always mental phenomena, mental contact. So next to him here we have Billy Mayer and the controversy, did he or did he not fake the photographs? And pretty much that question can be said by all of these. For me, photographs are dubious because you got no way of knowing the provenance of a photograph, basically. But, I mean, one can perhaps see how real contact with the unknown could perhaps lead to a real UFO experiencer choosing to fabricate an aspect of a tale just to make it more palatable for other people, more believable for others. However, is it possible that these partially understood proto-UFOs are indeed the precursors to the structured craft described in the contactee literature? So perhaps this cloud-like condensate that Police Sergeant Tony Dodd photographed in Addingham near Ilkley, West Yorkshire, all those years ago is actually how flying saucers become manifest. This is more consistent with what we've come to understand about the UFO phenomena from what I've just shown you. And also, this is also considered comparable with what my friend Pierre Sabac, researcher Pierre Sabac, describes as being a form of angel called Nubigini, which are the offspring of the cloud. So it's this etheric quality of the UFO experience that has been long been recognised as a source of frustration for nuts and bolts ufologists whose acceptance criteria for belief is that they can kick the tyres of the flying saucer or the engine of the alien manifestation. So initially they're spotted by Tony Dodd's wife while they were driving between Bolton Abbey and Addingham. The object that Tony Dodd described as having an array of hundreds of red lights around the periphery that would pulse off and on simultaneously. The object flew over the car and over the treetops and eventually out to sight, and Tony Dodd pulled over the car and stopped and got his camera out, and the object came back. And as the object receded away, he took the first photograph, which is the one on the left here, and then he took the one on the right as it was moving a bit further away. And he claims that the first photograph shows the UFO with a vapor trail and 3 glowing spheres. I'm assuming that's one of the spheres, and also you can the sphere with one beneath and this one up there as well. This idea of these spheres is actually comparable to the George Adamski's case. I'm sure you're aware of that. I mean, I because I'm from Skipton, probably Tony Dodd is basically one of my heroes, simply because he's the guy who, with his tireless work of being a ufologist, used to get all the UFO stories into the Keighley News, which is what I used to see as a kid, and that was my original exposure to the UFO phenomena. So it really comes from Tony Dodd's work locally where I live. So yeah, the spheres that you should be noted are also these are also claimed about by people like George Adamski. These photographs, however, were actually submitted to an organisation called Ground Saucer Watch, which was an Arizona-based organisation of scientists and engineers, and they stated that this was their first confirmed British UFO photograph, for whatever that's worth. So this is Howard and Connie Menger. Howard Menger, to me, it's one of the more interesting. Well, they're all interesting. One of the particularly interesting cases amongst the UFO contactees. From childhood, Menger and his brother would tell of seeing flying saucers, and Howard would tell of his conversations with extraterrestrials in the mountainous region near his home. As an adult, on many occasions, his experiences would be corroborated in part by friends and acquaintances. Those associates would report seeing UFOs, specifically plasma-like lights, interacting with Menger while they watched from a short distance away, while Menger himself would describe interacting with spacecraft and occupants. After one such visit to a particular place in the mountains near his home, Menger told his friends that the extraterrestrial contact felt the group could be trusted, and he said that she would make an appearance at the farmhouse where they were staying. According to Menger's witnesses, they went out with him and saw, away in the distance, over a wood in a field, a light moving through the trees. The apparition moved across a field like it was floating and passed through a fence as it moved. It stopped at such a distance that a vaguely human outline could be seen. Howard's friends claimed that they saw the light form, however they were not able to discern if the apparition was a physical entity or not. So I'm particularly intrigued by the poor quality of the form of this particular photograph, claimed by Howard Menger to be a photograph of an extraterrestrial that he took in 1956. And I'm reminded here of Rosemary and Guiley's shadow people, actually, and the similar poor form of the entities that appear as bedroom invaders. Where Rosemary and Guiley's suggestion is that the hat that these shadow men wear is kind of covers the fact that they find it difficult to mimic a hominid, basically human beings. Also, I've just this box. This seems to be holding a box. Actually, there's lots of tales in ufology about people seeing aliens holding a box there. It's like, I don't know if it's an occult thing as well. And I did actually get an email once from a guy from German barracks, actually, who told us a very short tale, really, of waking up in the night to find I can't remember how tall, reptilian holding a square box just in front of its chest. So perhaps these forms that the apparent entity takes is how they actually are. Perhaps these are just an approximation of how the entities are. Perhaps these are avatars. Maybe a projection made up of pure proto-UFO matter, basically plasma material rather than any solid material. You can add into this the concept that the human consciousness can directly impact on UFOs, such as Earth slides. Could this simply be explained as an external projection from the human conscious experience of consciousness? Is the human being projecting this onto a form? Is this driven by the human's consciousness? But even if that was the case, these forms were driven by the human's consciousness. Is it not possible that these could be driven by an external intelligence through either of those two the human's consciousness? I mean, this all seems very familiar to a context of another experiencer I've actually mentioned, another experiencer that I mentioned earlier. Jeffrey Hodgson, who was the author of Fairies at Work and Play, as I mentioned at the beginning, is a clairvoyant and a prolific fairy experiencer from the early 20th century. And he describes experiences with dozens of kinds of elementals, predominantly, if not always, seeing them as nature spirits and etheric. Yet I've always felt that there could be a physical component to the experiences that Hodgson describes the variety of entities. His exquisite description of a partially formed rock gnome, for instance, an embryonic entity that could, to my mind, point us to a more plausible origin of the source of these manifestations, the Earth. Deep within the solid rock behind us, there is a deep evolving consciousness, which manifests chiefly as formless blotches of colour, a sort of embryonic gnome. The beginnings of the head are visible and the shadow outline, together with the eyes and the mouth, but the rest of the body is only faintly suggested. The presence of this creature gives a certain individuality to the rock, noticeable on the physical plane as a magnetic vibration. It is difficult to judge its size, but it's probably 10 to 15 feet high. In his work, The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns and Fairies, Robert Kirk, who was a 17th century Gaelic speaker and minister to a remote Highland parish, documents for us the traditional beliefs of his parishioners, and he relates that relate to mysterious entities that Kirk termed the subterraneans. A name indicative of the belief that the origin and nature of these beings has been from within the earth. However, we find that Kirk's descriptions of fairies follows the trend that we've seen towards a cloud-like changeable form, reminiscent to our proto-UFO-like plasmas. So from the book it says, of the subterraneans, he describes the nature as being light, changeable bodies, somewhat of the nature of a condensed cloud best seen in twilight. Some have bodies of vehicles so sponges thin and defecate of congealed air, and of chameleon-like bodies that swim in the air. Curiously, tales reported by parishioners even suggest that Kirk himself may have had an experience on a fairy mound. He sunk down into a fit of apoplexy, which the unenlightened took for death, while the more understanding knew it to be a swoon produced by the supernatural influence of the people whose precincts he had violated. This notion of an induced neurological effect that we saw earlier, an apoplexy here is indicating loss of consciousness, and it's reminiscent of the loss or modification of consciousness described by Persinger, as he calls it, field-induced temporal epilepsy. The question is this produced by a purely natural phenomena, or ignoring the rule of methodological naturalism? Is there an intelligence external to the human mind at work, as both traditional beliefs in fairies and the modern belief in aliens holds to be true?